One of the most important dynamics to understand in toxic relationships is that the entire system is built around attention and emotional reactions. The relationship does not function the same way healthy relationships do. In a healthy connection, communication exists to build understanding, care, and mutual respect. In a narcissistic dynamic, however, communication often serves a very different purpose. It becomes a way for one person to feel important, powerful, or in control of someone else's emotional world. This is what many psychologists describe as emotional or psychological supply. It is the constant stream of attention, reactions, and engagement that keeps the dynamic alive. That supply can come in many different forms. It does not have to be admiration or praise. In fact, even arguments, frustration, or attempts to explain yourself can feed the dynamic. When you respond to criticism, defend yourself against accusations, or try to correct misunderstandings, you are still participating in the emotional exchange. From the outside, it may look like conflict or disagreement, but from a psychological perspective, it is still a form of engagement. The connection continues because the reactions continue. Over time, many people find themselves trapped in a cycle where they are constantly responding. They respond to texts, respond to accusations, respond to guilt trips, respond to sudden affection, and respond to periods of silence. Each response keeps the emotional system moving. It is almost like a machine that runs on reactions. The more reactions there are, the longer the system keeps operating. This is why silence changes everything. When communication stops completely, something essential disappears. The emotional fuel that once powered the relationship is suddenly gone. There are no more immediate reactions, no more explanations, no more attempts to repair or defend. The pattern that once depended on constant engagement suddenly has nothing to feed on. At first, this can feel extremely uncomfortable. Many people who step into silence notice that they feel restless or uneasy. After being conditioned to respond for so long, the absence of communication can create a strange sense of withdrawal. You may feel the urge to check your phone repeatedly. You might wonder if you should send a message just to clear the air. Your mind may replay past conversations, searching for closure or resolution, but this discomfort is often a sign that the dynamic is losing its hold. When the emotional supply disappears, the system that depended on it begins to weaken. Without someone constantly reacting, criticizing loses its impact. Manipulation has nowhere to land. Guilt messages, silent treatments, and emotional baiting cannot work if there is no engagement. The strategies that once created chaos slowly lose their effectiveness when they are no longer being answered. From the other side, the person who once relied on those reactions may experience this silence very differently. Some may attempt to provoke a reaction again later. Others may quickly shift their attention somewhere else where they can receive engagement more easily. But regardless of what they choose to do, the important shift has already happened. The emotional exchange that once kept the dynamic alive has stopped. And when that happens, something powerful begins to occur for the person who stepped away. Without constant emotional demands, the mind begins to calm down. The nervous system, which may have been operating in a constant state of stress or alertness, slowly begins to settle. The need to monitor every message, every tone of voice, and every emotional shift starts to fade. Space opens up where there used to be tension. This space allows for reflection. Many people begin noticing things they could not clearly see before. When you are constantly reacting in the middle of a conflict cycle, it is very difficult to step back and analyze what is really happening. The moment you stop participating, however, the pattern becomes easier to observe. Behaviors that once felt confusing start to look more predictable. You may realize how often the same arguments repeated themselves, or how frequently the focus shifted away from real solutions and back toward emotional drama. This growing awareness is not immediate. It often unfolds slowly over time, but as the silence continues, the emotional fog begins to clear. The energy that once went into managing the relationship starts returning to you. Instead of spending hours analyzing conversations or preparing for the next conflict, your attention gradually moves toward your own life, your own goals, and your own sense of stability. That is the deeper impact of removing emotional supply. It does not simply stop communication. It begins to break a cycle that once depended on constant reaction. And when that cycle no longer has the attention it relied on, its influence begins to fade. What once felt overwhelming starts to feel distant. What once demanded constant emotional energy begins to lose its urgency. And in that quiet space where the reactions used to be, something much healthier has room to grow: clarity, peace, and the slow return of your own emotional balance. When both people stop contacting each other, the silence that follows can feel surprisingly confusing. Many people expect that cutting off communication will immediately bring relief and peace. After all, if the relationship was filled with tension, arguments, and emotional exhaustion, it would seem logical that the absence of those things would instantly feel better. But the reality is often much more complicated. Instead of immediate calm, the silence can feel strange, unsettling, and even uncomfortable. This reaction happens because people become psychologically conditioned to the rhythm of the relationship. Over time, toxic dynamics create patterns that repeat again and again. There may be conflict, followed by apologies, followed by temporary calm, and then another round of tension. Even when those patterns are unhealthy, the mind becomes familiar with them. The brain starts to expect the next message, the next reaction, the next emotional shift. When that pattern suddenly disappears, the mind does not immediately know how to adjust. You may find yourself checking your phone more often than usual. Even though you chose to stop communicating, a part of your mind may still expect that a message will appear. You might wonder whether they are thinking about reaching out, whether they are waiting for you to contact them, or whether the silence means something more permanent. These questions can begin to fill the quiet space that the relationship once occupied. Another reason the silence feels uncomfortable is that many people are used to resolving emotional tension through communication. When something feels unfinished or unresolved, the instinct is often to talk about it. People want explanations, closure, or some kind of final conversation that brings clarity. But in many toxic dynamics, those conversations rarely lead to true understanding. Instead, they often lead back into the same cycle of blame, confusion, and emotional intensity. Still, the desire for closure can remain very strong. Without contact, your mind may start replaying past conversations. You may analyze things that were said months ago, wondering whether you could have explained something better or handled a moment differently. You might think about messages you never sent or responses you wish you had given. The silence can create a space where these thoughts grow louder, especially in the beginning. At the same time, there can also be a strange sense of emptiness. When a relationship takes up a large amount of emotional energy, its absence can leave a gap in your daily routine. Even if many of those interactions were stressful, they still created a sense of connection and activity. The arguments, the reconciliations, the emotional highs and lows, all of those experiences filled time and mental space. When that stimulation disappears, life can briefly feel quieter than expected. This does not mean the silence is harmful. In many cases, it simply means your mind is adjusting. After spending so much time in a state of emotional intensity, calmness can feel unfamiliar. It is similar to leaving a very noisy environment and suddenly stepping into a silent room. At first, the quiet feels almost uncomfortable because your senses are still expecting the noise. Over time, however, the mind begins to adapt. The constant urge to check for messages slowly decreases. The thoughts that once replayed conversations begin to appear less often. The emotional tension that used to build around every interaction starts to fade. Gradually, the silence begins to feel less like an absence and more like a form of relief. This transition does not happen overnight. For many people, it takes patience and self-awareness. During the early stages of no contact, it is very easy to interpret the silence in negative ways. Some people worry that they were not important enough for the other person to reach out. Others fear that the silence means the relationship meant nothing. These thoughts can trigger feelings of rejection or self-doubt, but in many cases, the silence simply reflects the end of the cycle. Without someone responding to messages, defending themselves, or trying to repair the relationship, the dynamic no longer has the same momentum. The absence of contact can feel unusual precisely because it interrupts a pattern that once dominated daily life. As the days and weeks pass, something subtle begins to change. The quiet that once felt uncomfortable slowly becomes easier to tolerate. The emotional urgency that once surrounded every interaction begins to dissolve. Your mind starts to shift its focus toward other parts of your life, your work, your interests, your friendships, and your personal growth. Eventually, the silence that once felt confusing begins to reveal something important. It shows how much of your mental energy was previously tied to the relationship. And as that energy slowly returns to you, the uncomfortable quiet starts transforming into something far more valuable. It becomes space to think clearly, space to regain emotional balance, and space to rediscover a life that is no longer controlled by constant reactions and unpredictable communication. One of the most powerful shifts that happens when communication stops is that emotional distance begins to weaken the psychological grip of the relationship. When people are deeply involved in a difficult or toxic dynamic, the connection often feels incredibly strong, even when it is painful. Many individuals describe feeling as though they cannot fully detach, even when they know the relationship is unhealthy. This feeling is not simply about love or attachment. It is often the result of repeated emotional patterns that slowly create a powerful psychological bond. These bonds are built through cycles of emotional intensity. There may be moments of criticism, tension, or conflict, followed by moments of warmth, attention, or reconciliation. The contrast between these emotional highs and lows can create a very strong attachment. When someone experiences both distress and relief within the same relationship, the mind begins to associate that person with powerful emotional experiences. Over time, this pattern can make the relationship feel almost addictive, even when it is damaging. When communication continues, that emotional cycle keeps repeating. Every message, every argument, and every moment of contact restarts the pattern. Even a short conversation can bring back the same feelings that existed before: confusion, hope, frustration, or the desire to explain yourself. Because the interaction continues, the emotional bond remains active. But when distance enters the picture, the cycle begins to change. Without regular communication, the emotional triggers appear less often. There are fewer opportunities for arguments, fewer moments of sudden affection, and fewer situations where you feel the need to defend yourself or seek approval. The dramatic shifts in emotion that once defined the relationship start to occur less frequently. As a result, the intensity of the bond begins to fade. At first, this change may not be obvious. In the early stages of silence, many people still feel strongly connected. They may think about the other person often, wonder what they are doing, or replay past experiences in their mind. The psychological grip does not disappear immediately. However, the important difference is that the cycle is no longer being reinforced through new interactions. Without constant reinforcement, emotional patterns begin to lose their strength. Think of it like a habit that slowly fades when it is no longer repeated. When the brain stops experiencing the same emotional triggers again and again, it gradually starts forming new patterns of thinking. The urgency that once surrounded the relationship begins to decrease. Situations that once caused intense emotional reactions slowly become less overwhelming. Another important part of this process is that distance allows the mind to step out of survival mode. In many toxic relationships, people spend a great deal of time anticipating the next conflict or emotional shift. They may carefully analyze every message, worry about saying the wrong thing, or constantly try to prevent the next argument. This creates a state of mental tension where the mind is always on alert. When the contact stops, that constant state of alertness begins to relax. Without new messages arriving or unexpected emotional reactions appearing, the brain slowly realizes that the immediate threat of conflict is no longer present. The nervous system starts calming down, and with that calmness comes clearer thinking. This clarity makes it easier to see the relationship in a more balanced way. When you are actively inside the cycle, your attention is focused on managing the moment. You are responding to the latest comment, the latest disagreement, or the latest attempt to pull you back into the conversation. It is very difficult to step back and evaluate the bigger picture when you are constantly reacting. Distance changes that perspective. With time, people often begin to notice patterns they could not fully see before. They may realize how often the same issues repeated themselves or how frequently conversations turned into emotional confusion. Situations that once felt complicated may start to appear more predictable. The emotional intensity that once blurred the details slowly fades, allowing a clearer understanding of what the relationship actually looked like. As this awareness grows, the psychological hold of the relationship weakens even further. The person who once occupied so much mental space begins to take up less of it. Thoughts about them become less frequent, and when they do appear, they may carry less emotional weight. Instead of feeling pulled back into the cycle, you may start observing the memories with a greater sense of distance and understanding. This shift is often surprising for many people. At one point, the connection may have felt impossible to escape. The emotions were intense, the interactions were consuming, and the idea of stepping away may have seemed overwhelming. Yet with enough distance and time, the psychological grip slowly loosens. The key factor in this change is the absence of ongoing engagement. Without new emotional exchanges feeding the cycle, the bond gradually loses its intensity. The space created by silence allows the mind to reorganize itself, moving away from constant reaction and toward stability and clarity. In that growing distance, something important begins to return, a sense of personal control over your own thoughts, emotions, and decisions. The relationship no longer dominates your mental landscape the way it once did. Instead, it becomes one chapter of your past rather than the center of your present. And that quiet shift, created simply by distance, can slowly transform a connection that once felt overwhelming into something that no longer has the same power over your life. When manipulation and emotional pressure are no longer part of your daily life, something remarkable begins to happen inside your mind. The constant confusion that once surrounded the relationship slowly begins to clear, and mental clarity starts returning in ways that can feel both surprising and deeply revealing. Many people who step away from a toxic dynamic do not immediately realize how much their thinking had been affected by the environment they were in. In relationships filled with manipulation, conversations often leave people feeling uncertain about their own perceptions. You may walk away from an interaction wondering whether you misunderstood something, whether you reacted too strongly, or whether the problem was somehow your fault. Over time, repeated experiences like this can create a kind of mental fog. Instead of feeling confident about what you saw or felt, you begin second-guessing your own understanding of events. This confusion is not accidental. Manipulative dynamics often depend on shifting responsibility, denying previous statements, or reframing situations in ways that create doubt. When this happens repeatedly, the mind becomes busy trying to solve a puzzle that never quite fits together. You might spend hours analyzing conversations, trying to make sense of contradictions, or attempting to figure out how a simple discussion turned into something emotionally overwhelming. As long as the interactions continue, the confusion continues as well. Every new conversation brings another opportunity for the same patterns to repeat themselves. A moment of calm might be followed by criticism. A disagreement might suddenly turn into an accusation. Something you thought was resolved may be brought up again in a completely different way. These shifting dynamics keep the mind constantly engaged, trying to interpret and respond. When the communication stops, however, the environment that created that confusion disappears. At first, your mind may still replay past conversations. This is a normal part of the adjustment period. After spending so much time trying to understand the relationship, your brain may continue analyzing it even in the absence of new interactions. You might revisit certain memories, trying to determine what really happened or why certain situations felt so unsettling. But without new manipulation entering the picture, the process of reflection begins to change. Instead of reacting to fresh confusion, your mind now has space to examine the past more calmly. The emotional pressure that once pushed you to defend yourself or explain your feelings is no longer present. Without that pressure, the details of the relationship can start appearing more clearly. Many people notice that events they once struggled to understand begin making more sense. Conversations that felt chaotic or overwhelming may reveal patterns when viewed from a distance. You might remember moments when your concerns were dismissed, when your feelings were minimized, or when the focus of the conversation suddenly shifted away from the original issue. During the relationship, these moments may have felt isolated or confusing, but with time and distance, they begin to connect like pieces of a larger picture. This is where mental clarity really begins to emerge. Instead of constantly questioning your reactions, You may start recognizing that many of your responses were natural reactions to difficult situations. The frustration you felt, the exhaustion you experienced, and the confusion that followed certain interactions begin to look less like personal flaws and more like understandable responses to a challenging environment. Another important change is that your thoughts become quieter. In manipulative relationships, the mind often feels crowded. There are endless questions, worries about the next conversation, and concerns about how the other person might react. You may spend a great deal of time planning what to say, preparing for possible arguments, or trying to avoid saying the wrong thing. When those interactions stop, that mental noise gradually decreases. You may notice that you spend less time rehearsing conversations in your head. The urge to constantly analyze someone else's behavior begins to fade. Instead of focusing on what the other person might think or do, your attention slowly shifts back toward your own life and your own well-being. This shift creates room for clearer thinking. With fewer emotional distractions, your mind becomes better able to focus on your priorities, your goals, and the things that bring you a sense of stability. Decisions that once felt overwhelming may begin to feel simpler. You start trusting your own judgment again, because you are no longer navigating a situation where your perceptions were regularly challenged. For many people, this return of clarity is one of the most powerful parts of stepping away from a manipulative dynamic. It does not mean every question is answered immediately, and it does not erase the emotional impact of the past, but it does allow you to see the relationship more realistically. The confusion that once clouded your thinking slowly lifts, revealing patterns and truths that were difficult to recognize while you were still inside the cycle. Over time, this clarity strengthens your sense of confidence and self-trust. You begin to rely on your own observations rather than constantly seeking validation from someone else. Your thoughts feel more organized, your emotions feel more balanced, and your understanding of the past becomes more grounded in reality. And perhaps most importantly, you start realizing that the confusion you once carried was not a reflection of weakness or misunderstanding. It was often the natural result of being in an environment where clarity was repeatedly disrupted. Once that environment is no longer present, your mind gradually finds its way back to a clearer and more stable place. When communication between you and the narcissistic person stops, many people naturally expect that the other person will try to return quickly. Movies, stories, and even personal experiences sometimes create the belief that the silence will trigger a dramatic attempt to reconnect. People often imagine that the narcissistic person will suddenly realize what they lost and rush back with apologies, emotional messages, or attempts to pull the relationship back together. But in many situations, something very different happens. Instead of reaching out, the narcissistic person may simply shift their attention somewhere else. This can feel shocking and even painful for the person who stepped away because it raises difficult questions about what the relationship really meant. To understand this reaction, it helps to look at how narcissistic dynamics often operate. In these relationships, attention and validation are extremely important. The narcissistic person often seeks environments where they can feel admired, important, or emotionally powerful. If one source of attention becomes unavailable, they may begin searching for another source that can provide the same kind of emotional engagement. This does not always mean the previous relationship was completely forgotten. Rather, it reflects a pattern where attention becomes the central focus. When communication stops and there is no longer a steady flow of reactions, admiration, or conflict to engage with, the situation may no longer serve the same psychological purpose. As a result, the narcissistic person may start directing their energy towards someone new. For the person who chose silence, this realization can create mixed emotions. On one hand, it might feel like confirmation that the relationship was not as meaningful as it once seemed. On the other hand, it may trigger feelings of rejection or comparison. You might find yourself wondering why they appeared to move on so quickly or questioning whether you are easily replaceable. These reactions are very common, and they are often connected to the emotional investment that was placed into the relationship. When you spend a long time trying to understand someone, support them, or repair conflicts, it is natural to hope that the connection held deep meaning on both sides. Seeing them redirect their attention elsewhere can feel like a sudden shift in the story you believed you were part of. However, this behavior often says more about their patterns than it does about your worth. In many narcissistic dynamics, the focus is less about building a stable connection and more about maintaining a steady flow of emotional engagement. When that engagement disappears, the search for a new environment that provides it may begin. Another important factor is that seeking new attention can serve as a way to avoid reflection. Silence creates space for people to examine their behavior and consider the impact their actions had on the relationship. For someone who struggles with accountability or self-examination, that quiet space can feel uncomfortable. Moving quickly toward new interactions may help them avoid sitting with those difficult questions. From the outside, this can look like they simply replace the relationship without hesitation. But the deeper issue is often about maintaining a sense of importance or validation. By entering a new dynamic, they may be able to recreate the same emotional patterns they experienced before receiving attention, admiration, or reactions that reinforce their sense of control or significance. For the person who stepped away, this moment can become a turning point in understanding the relationship more clearly. At first, it may hurt to see them invest energy elsewhere. It can feel as though the time, effort, and emotional commitment you gave were not valued in the way you hoped. Yet over time, this realization can also provide clarity. If the connection could be replaced so quickly, it may highlight that the relationship was built more on emotional exchange than on genuine partnership. Healthy relationships typically involve deeper investment, empathy, and shared responsibility for each other's well-being. When those qualities are missing, attention can shift more easily from one person to another. This does not erase the experiences you had or the emotions you felt. Your investment was real, and the impact of the relationship was real. But the way the other person responds to silence can reveal the nature of the dynamic more honestly than many of the conversations that happened during the relationship. Instead of trying to understand why they moved on or who they are now focusing on, the healthier direction is often to turn your attention inward. The silence that once felt uncertain becomes an opportunity to rebuild your own sense of stability and self-worth. The energy that once went into managing the relationship can now be used to strengthen your own life, your friendships, your goals, and your emotional well-being. In time, the fact that they shifted their attention elsewhere may no longer feel shocking. Instead, it